All right. Well, hey, I'm on. And I'm loud. How about that? I know that I am what stands between you and lunch. They love to put me in this slot for whatever reason, so I'll try to stick to time. I'm Rebecca Murphy, and yeah, she already said all the rest of it, so we can get started. I want to start with a question. How many of you are working on a code base that's more than a year old? Okay, that was an easy one. Hands up, keep them up. How about more than 2 years? More than 5? 2 hands. So that means 10? Because that's the next question. Is more than 10? Who's left? All right, we have a handful of people who still have their hands up at 10, but not a whole lot. So I got a job a few months ago. I did not find it on Indeed.com. But they found me, so it all worked out in the end. I got a job a few months ago at Indeed, and if you haven't heard of us, we're basically the largest job search site in the world. We're in lots of countries, and I'm still kind of new, so I'm not sure exactly what I can tell you about how many people we see every month, but it would take 9 numbers and a couple of commas to be able to say it, if I was able to say it, which I need to find out, but my boss has been on parental leave for the last 6 weeks. So my job at Indeed is to evangelize front-end best practices across teams and to build tools that make it easier for us to do front-end well at Indeed. It's a new role at the company. We typically have hired really smart people and not really asked them to specialize. And over the course of, I think Indeed's been around for close to 12 years now. Over the course of those 12 years, as we've gone from just being a pretty simple job search site to building more and more and more tools and applications, really, not just the core website, we've kind of started to see that just having generalists who do front end sometimes isn't necessarily a great long-term strategy for how we do front end development. And so yeah, it's a new role at the company, and when I started, my boss and I thought that it would be good for me to rotate through a few different teams, Indeed, to kind of see the state of front-end development before I really dug in and started trying to change anything. And so my first stop was the team that develops the mobile job search site. Looks like this. It's actually a really simple site with just a few types of pages in it, really just like 4 key pages in it. The pages are server rendered, and then they're augmented with JavaScript on the client side. And I don't actually know how old this code base is, but somebody at Indeed does. But I decided to go try and figure it out myself, so I went to the first git commit, and I found this, which is when they imported it from Subversion in 2008. And so I don't do Subversion, it's like a rule. And I was using Subversion in 2008, though. So I don't do Subversion, so I didn't keep going back in history, but that's pretty old, 2008. And I didn't try to actually run the code at that commit either. Maybe I could have, but better things to do. But I can tell you, number one, that it was a fully fledged application. You could search for a job, find a job, click on a job, apply for the job. And number two, it was using an old school, that doc type that had like slashes in it and like looked like XML, had one of those. And the most interesting thing is that there were approximately 0 lines of JavaScript in this application at this moment in time. There may have been a couple of lines of inline JavaScript in the HTML, but there weren't any JavaScript files. So if we think about what was going on back around then, raise your hand if you were a professional web developer when this came out. Okay, wow, not that many of you. Feeling old and sniffly as usual. So if I had to guess, and I get actually goosebumpy when I start to think about this, if you weren't around when this came out, it's hard to understand how this kind of completely transformed web development and what it meant to build things for the web and how we use the web and the expectations that we had around the web. And so if I had to guess, I bet that mobile app actually had its genesis right around the same time as this came out. probably around sometime in 2007. And it probably had a lot to do with the fact that the desktop site for Indeed.com, which up until then had just been called the site, didn't look so hot on a tiny screen. And we needed a strategy for that. So back in 2007, I was working at my first job as a full-time web developer. I was at a small interactive agency called Web Slingers with a Z on the end. Everything's cooler with a Z on the end. And I was mostly doing HTML and CSS, but every now and then I got to do some actual programming with Flash, of course. That was like make things move on the screen, very exciting. A lot of people were talking about jQuery in 2007. It was definitely like on the scene. It had come out a couple of years before, but of course its logo looked like this for reasons that we don't know. Maybe John has a blog post about it somewhere. And jQuery was neat, like it was cool, whatever. But people who were doing serious web development back then were obviously using comprehensive monolithic frameworks, like Dojo, which came out in 2004. YUI, it's from this company called Yahoo that maybe you've heard of. I was at the grocery store the other day. I got a Yahoo like reusable shopping bag at a conference a couple years ago, back when they still showed up to conferences. So it says Yahoo on the side of the exclamation point. And the cashier was like, "I really like your bag." And I was like, cool, whatever. And then as I was walking out to my car, I realized that she had absolutely no idea what Yahoo even was, which is pretty unbelievable. That would be like not knowing what Google is. Like that was the kind of the how powerful Yahoo was in the world of the web back in those days, and now they're kind of not. So their YUI library was a Dojo competitor. There was also Sprout Core, which was the precursor of Ember. And EXT.js was also taking its own kind of monolithic stab at building the tools that we'd use to create the web apps of the future. And this is kind of the vision, again, of like how we would build web apps circa 2007, 2008. What's more interesting, though, is to think about what didn't exist back then. Nicole Sullivan's object-oriented CSS, which was the first stab that anyone had really taken at how do we make CSS not suck at a large scale and over time, that was still 2 years away. It would come out in 2009. Way down in the lower corner, there's a date on there, yeah, February 16th, 2009. It wouldn't be until later that year that Ryan Dahl would show up at JSConf EU to talk about his stab at running JavaScript on the server called Node. And of course, there were other ways of running JavaScript on the server before then, but no one had paid a whole lot of attention to them. And NPM, which is like, again, goosebumps, like such an integral part of how we do modern front-end development, that was still a couple years away after that. In 2009, we also got Underscore, but it would be 3 more years before John David Dalton would say, "This is stupid, here's Lodash." And we also, around 2010, I think, got Backbone. I actually remember being at a conference toward the end of 2010, I think, and somebody asking me, like, "What do you think of Backbone?" I was like, "Whoa, that came out like 2 weeks ago. I have no idea what I think of Backbone, but get back to me." And Backbone was fascinating because it was not this big monolithic framework. It was really tiny, a handful, like single-digit K. Compressed and minified. And it also was the first, and I might be speaking personally, but I think this is true generally, it was the first lightweight client-side application development framework that made application development feel accessible to people who had kind of grown up with jQuery. And so it was really transformative in that, and at the same time, you have things like Underscore coming out, which is like, here's this tiny little thing. You don't need Dojo in order to be able to iterate over an array. God forbid the browsers let you iterate over an array. That was still a while away. So Backbone was, again, this kind of transformative thing that just didn't exist back at the time that the iPhone came out. Responsive web design. When these tiny screens first came out, and we're like tiny. If you haven't held a original iPhone and like looked at the blurry screen at 320 pixels wide or whatever, like do that. It's not Retina. in any way, shape, or form. And so these tiny screens, there had been agencies actually that going back to 2004 had been figuring out how to design for smaller screens and how to make a responsive design. But the words responsive web design wouldn't be coined until 2010. So we had these devices, but we didn't have like language to describe how we approached them and how we approached designing for them. There were module loaders. I don't know, I was supposed to look it up before I got up here and I completely forgot. I was supposed to look up when Require.js came out. Anyone? Anyone? It wasn't part of Dojo. It's complicated. It's complicated. I think 2010, 2011 is probably when Require came out. Require was also this completely transformative thing because it took the module loading out of the library and made it this independent piece of technology. So up until then, you had YUI's way of loading modules and Dojo's way of loading modules, but Require, even though please do not use it. I love you, James Burke, and you've been a wonderful human, but please do not use Require today. At the time, it was this again, really transformative thing. Webpack wouldn't see its first commit until 2012. We'd have to wait for 2013 for two Facebook engineers to get up on the stage at a resort in Florida and get mercilessly mocked on Twitter, possibly even to their faces, for suggesting that we would put XML in our JavaScript. And it wouldn't be until about 2014 that we would start to realize that maybe that was not such a bad idea after all. And so as the web was kind of becoming this thing that we know today, back in our mobile application, things were really pretty boring for quite a while. When it first started, like I said, there were approximately 0 lines of JavaScript, and in 2009, JavaScript finally got its own file. Up until then, it all had been just inline. And that file was a few hundred lines by 2011, and there were about 1,000 lines at the beginning of 2013. Then this interesting thing happened. So up until then, this code base had just been kind of growing really organically. Really interesting thing happened around 2013. Based on our success with it on some other projects, I wasn't there, but based on our success with it on some other projects, we decided to add one of these monolithic frameworks, the Google Closure Library. Please don't use that either. Yeah, I have a lot of feels about that. But so it's interesting to see, like, we added this library around sometime after the beginning of the year in 2013. And by 2014, those 1,000 lines had grown to 3,200. They were 6,300 in the beginning of 2015, and they were 12,000 when I showed up at the beginning of this year. And so we added this tool that was supposed to make our lives easier and better, and we used it. And as we used it, our application just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And bigger isn't necessarily bad. To add functionality, you have to add code. And taking functionality away at the same time is like a hard sell and maybe not even a good idea. So I don't want to say that growth is bad, but growth without a strategy for managing it, that can be a challenge. And so a hallmark of code in this app, and a lot of code from this era, code that kind of grew up in the late 2000s, is that it's heavily focused on manipulating the DOM and not on data. Like, it wasn't until Backbone that we started to get this notion of, like, we should have a model that backs this view. And so, again, because it grew slowly from a few hundred lines, and because we never paused and said, like, this is getting out of hand, we need a strategy, there was never any overriding architecture for this code. We just added a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more for every new feature and for every new bug. So in 2016, this application makes us a lot of money. Definitely not allowed to tell you how much, but there's like this cool graph that I can go and see, like, how much money we made today from IE8 in Italy or whatever. And yeah, it turns out that letting people search for jobs on their phones is pretty lucrative. Like seriously, we make a lot of money from this application. And a team of developers releases new features and improvements and new A/B tests a couple of times a week still, 8 years, 9 years later. And the problem, of course, is that the risk and the developer time that's associated with any change these days is increasing right along with that graph. And you can feel it. And when I showed up, the developers were so hungry for somebody to tell them how to make it better because they can feel it too. And at the same time as that graph is going up and the time it takes to deliver features is going up, we were also seeing the performance of the application gradually decline. The percentage of page views that we were able to serve, or render, I should say, in less than a second had been pretty satisfactory. And as that graph went up, that percentage of less than one second renders was going down. And figuring out how to make that stuff better in a code base that has just been cobbled together over the course of 9 years is a pretty hard problem. And a few years ago, I would have said that the only hope here was a rewrite. So much of the front-end conversation these days is centered around this new tool and everything's better with React, and everything is better with React. I can make a React app in my sleep or after 3 beers. I can make anything happen with React. It's amazing. And you read about them and you watch conference talks about them, and if you're a developer who's working on a project from 2007 or even a project from way back in 2013, it can seem like the only way to make things better is to start from scratch. And I'm a grown-up now, and I know that that's not actually a thing. I've done it. I've given talks about it. And it's really easy to rewrite a product that has approximately no customers. This is the proverbial trying to change the tires while the car is in motion kind of thing. But it's not a car. It's it's like a freight train, really. I did the same accidental click last time I did this. There we are. And so number one, the challenges of a rewrite. Number one, you're guaranteed to screw up. You will break something that works in the current application. You probably can't afford to break something that works in an application that's seeing hundreds of millions of uniques every month. Literally, that will cost you money. Sustaining development alongside a rewrite is expensive too. You could say, oh, we'll just keep the old one around until we're done with it. Well, no. You'll never be done. If you do go with a rewrite strategy, you will have to just sort of cut the cord one day and accept what you've done. But even in the meantime, sustaining development alongside a rewrite is expensive on a application that actually has users. The other thing is that you are probably inexperienced with whatever new technology you choose for this. So if you've been working on an application that has kind of evolved over the course of years, and now you're like, I know, let's use React. Well, if you've never used React before on an application that has actual users and that is of an actual scale, there's nothing to really say you aren't going to get yourself in kind of the same mess that you're in, or your future coworkers who will be there when you've long ago moved on. And so today I want to talk a little bit about what I took away from my time working on this vintage project. We will not call it legacy. That's a bad word. Where the mandate really was to make it better without making it over. And if you've already worked on an app like this, I hope it might just sort of help you think about how you could get your project to a better place. And if not, I hope it'll give you some perspective on kind of the world of web development and how it's evolved over the years, and also a little bit about just kind of how to have empathy for the people who came before you, because that can be a really hard thing. Again, speaking personally, that can be a really hard thing when you show up to a project like this. So my first task when I showed up was a really simple starter bug. We were logging something that happened, like when a user took some action, we were sending a log event, and we weren't logging some important piece of data at that moment, like we had just forgotten. And so this was a bug. And so they set me out to fix it, because that's what you do when someone's new on your project, is you give them a simple bug to fix. So I went hunting through the code to figure out, like, where does this data actually get sent? And I found it, and that was easy. And then I went sort of traversing back up the code to figure out, like, okay, how do I get the piece of data that I need to that code down there? And this is what I found. I found the place where I needed to add the one new, value. And then, yeah, I found this. Zooming in, those are 40 arguments. I counted them, so you don't have to. This was the initialization function for the page. It received 40 arguments, and it proceeded to call several functions, which received some subset of those 40 arguments, and they proceeded to call some more functions, which received some subset of that subset of 40 arguments. And I'm new. I want to impress people and be like, I know JavaScript. And but I have this moment, like, do I add argument 41? Because that is the most expedient way to dispose of this issue. And instead I said, no, like, now I know why I'm here. This is what I am here to do on this team. I didn't know it before then, but this is what I'm here to do on this team, is to make this go away. And what really influenced me as I was thinking about how to make this go away, obviously we could just pass an object instead of 40 arguments. Like, that's not wild and crazy to think that we could pass an object, but that doesn't really solve anything. Like, now we just have an object that has 40 properties on it. If we're still passing it down and down and down and down and down, we still have some problems. And so we did do that first, like pass an object, but we call it a model, because that's kind of what it is. It's like the data that the page is going to need to render. And then not only that, but we initialized models that were global to the page for the rest of that page's execution, so that rather than having to pass this data down and down and down and down, anywhere that you needed it, you could just be like, hey model, what's my user ID? You didn't have to pass user ID all the way through. We even, just on the last slide, which I'm not going to try to go back to because it always screws up. On the last slide, I had the Redux logo. We've even talked about actually adding Redux to this project and letting it be that central store of state, and propagating events out when things happen, so that the page can respond. That's like, it's not far-fetched to think that you could actually bring that technology. We haven't done it yet. We have bigger fish to fry, but it's not far-fetched to think you could bring that technology back to this vintage application. The work that I had to do to introduce that single source of state was like super scary. And it was scary because I realized that I was making massive changes to a code base I didn't know, and there was really nothing to protect me from screwing up. And so one of the things that I was really missing, that I believe you should set up from day one on any new application, was ESLint. The application did have a linter, the closure linter. And the closure linter is really passionate about whether you have 2 new lines above comments versus 1. Feels really strongly about that. But if you have a global variable, it's just like, it's cool, it's good, it's fine. Or an undeclared variable, or declaring variables inside of block, like, no big deal. Probably it'll work out. And so I was really scared that if I made any of those sorts of mistakes, I didn't have anything to fix them. And so we added ESLint to the project, which meant fixing 250 places where we weren't using strict equality. We were using double equals instead of triple equals, which is a really scary change to make, because there are a lot of cases where we were actually depending on the bad behavior of double equals. And there were also easily 100 places where we were declaring variables inside of blocks. And it was a pretty miserable couple of days to do this. Luckily, it only did take a couple of days to do it, and then there was a lot of QA after. And we did find some bugs. But the really neat thing about this was not that I had these guardrails, but that it kind of elevated JavaScript among the members of this team. It let them know, like, there is a right way to do this, and we can verify that it's being done correctly. And up until then, they had just looked at this as like, this is the Wild West, and like, if it works, I'm just committing it and closing my computer and walking away. And so this gave them this idea that like this is a thing that you can do well and a thing that you can do right, and that was really powerful. Another lesson that I learned kind of the hard way is that, you know, I've told you 2 things that I did. This is the first thing that I should have done because those other 2 things broke some things. And that was just instrumenting key user features, talking to the product owner and saying, like, what's important to you? What will you be mad at me about if I break? And we learned this the hard way because I broke something that we didn't have any sort of monitoring around. And we didn't know that it was broken until several days later when somebody experienced it being broken. And then we were able to go back and look at a graph and see that a line had just fallen off a cliff the day that my changes were released. And so what we did is I did that interview with the product owner and say, like, what are the key actions that a user can take? And then I looked in the code and wrote some Java. I looked in the code, wrote some Java to find out when a user takes that action, what gets communicated back to the server, and then we started actually, at that moment, also sending an event to Datadog so that we could make those pretty graphs that I just showed you. And we can make those graphs in real time, and so when we do a release now, if we've broken something key, we will see those graphs in real time fall off a cliff. And that was really just a matter of adding 1 line of code around every time that the client-side application was interacting with the API. The other thing that was, the other thing that was interesting about adding ESLint was that adding ESLint required me to add a package JSON file to the project. And this is another thing that you just kind of take for granted in modern application development, is your application will probably have a package JSON file in it, but this one didn't. And so I added this package JSON file, which let us do things like add Git hooks that would run ESLint for us. It gave us like a simple script that would let us run ESLint. It also let us hook those NPM scripts up to our AMP-based build system so that Jenkins can now call out to NPM and run these. And because we've standardized a whole lot of things about how we do back-end development at Indeed, I was able to plug into those things really easily and start to kind of claw my way to some standardization around the front end. So now, thanks to me writing some XML, any project that has NPM scripts can get those running in Jenkins just through the Ant system. I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time and I have a couple more things to say that are more important than this. So I want to talk a little bit about just kind of what I learned from this exercise of going back to the past and thinking about it and what it was like to do web development. One of the things, if you haven't read this article from Tessa Thornton, it was really, really powerful to me when I read it. She really kind of broke down, so many people are like, how do I learn new web technologies? How do I get from like I know HTML and CSS to I know React? And she really broke it down, but one of my favorite things that she said in this article was it's unrealistic for you to learn a framework that solves a problem you've never experienced. And it's easy to think about these vintage applications as like, ew, I don't want to work on that. I want to work with React. But the thing that I see is that the people who are working on these applications and having to solve problems, if they take the time to understand the nature of the problems and think about the nature of the problems and think about like, how would I get shared state into this vintage application? They are eventually way better developers than somebody who just picked React up and started drinking 3 beers and making React apps because it really is that easy. Like when you have to really deeply experience the challenges of an application that doesn't have a well-designed architecture, it's an incredible opportunity to start thinking about what it means to have a well-engineered architecture, a well-designed architecture. The other thing I want to say is that every technology decision that we make is eventually regrettable. The people who decided to use Clojure in 2013 and the people who made every decision in this app, even the person who added argument number 40 to that function, they all made those decisions in good faith using the best information that they had at the time. And this has been a real thing for me to kind of remember and drill into my own head that like doing web development is an exercise in empathy always, but not just empathy for the user, but also empathy for the people who made the things that you are now working on. And understanding that they were not out to make your life difficult. They were out to get their job done in the best and fastest way that they knew how. And it's also important to remember that there's little reason to believe that the decisions we would make today are going to stand the test of time any better 14,000 commits later from who knows how many team members over the course of years and years and years. I also want to, I didn't really dwell on this, but that graph scared the hell out of me when I actually made it, because it really drives this home that framework or no, as you add tools, as you add features, just as your product ages, the growth of JavaScript is kind of inevitable. We can't avoid it, but we have to manage it. We have to understand the risks that it kind of presents. And this isn't just JavaScript, this is everything. But in JavaScript, the risks are kind of unique because you're sending bytes over the wire. And so your application can get larger and larger and larger and more complex, but you have to manage that complexity and manage the risk that kind of accrues as you do that work. And another thing I learned, I alluded to this when I was talking about ESLint, is that teaching people that they could care, and like I use the word care, but care is not the right word. Like care sounds judgy. It's not that they didn't care, it's that they didn't know what to care about, and they didn't know how to care about things in front-end development. And so teaching them how to care and what to care about has been just tremendously transformative. I'm seeing people really, like, they're coming to me and saying, like, how do I do this? I see the problem now, and now I believe there must be a solution, and I'm not just gonna commit it and close my computer because it works. And so that has been a really powerful thing. Just to have these conversations has really elevated front-end development among engineers who haven't traditionally been focused on it. The last thing that I want to say is that I read like these JS fatigue articles and whatever, and it's just like, I dare you to go back to 2007 and try to build the applications that we can build today. Maybe if you are overwhelmed by Webpack and Babel and React and all these things, like, I get it, they are overwhelming, and setting up your first Webpack and Babel project, like that, it's hard, I get it, but like, I do not want to live in a world where we do not have these tools. They are so powerful. And yeah, building for the web is just better today. So I'm Rebecca. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Indeed for letting me be here. And have a great lunch and great rest of your day.
One thing that I always think is like funny, and I like to satirize the web development world because people do take themselves a little too seriously. And there seems to be no end of it because it's constantly evolving. And you were saying how like building for the web is a lot better today. And I'm sure like 10 years ago, people said, it's a lot better now than it was before. It's like, it's always like getting better. There's always more better tools, but you can't deny the whole past. You have to sort of clean up what was going on. And that's just sort of the state of the industry. It's something everyone's gonna have to deal with. People are gonna have to fix my stuff in like 5 years. What are we doing today that's gonna be like the big, like, oh, what were they thinking in 5 years?
That's I thought you were gonna ask me a much more softball question than that. And I was gonna say, just code for change, which is a thing. Like code for the fact that it's going to change. What are we doing today? I think it is still, I really want this framework stuff to settle because I think that there still is so much fragmentation there that like one of them is gonna win. Obviously, I kind of think it's gonna be React, but I don't know. And so it's not that we're gonna regret it, but if you look back at these applications that were built with Dojo and built with YUI, especially if they were just like, oh, look, this is a thing that solves all our problems rather than let's engineer a good application using this tool. And maybe that's it. Maybe we're like leaning on frameworks, and we have been leaning on frameworks. So we just think that like adding one solves problems when really it just like, it just papers over the easy, it like solves the easy problems and you're just left with hard problems. And so, but is that like, we should be better? No, that's just like human nature, and the reality of software development is that we ask our tools to engineer for us, and they do, but only up to a point. And so I think like, know your tools, understand your tools, experience different tools, go build an, like if you've never built an app with Backbone and you're on the React bandwagon, then go do that. If you've never built an app with Ember and you're on the React bandwagon, go do that. And just kind of understanding the nature of the problems and not just like, you know, the Ember component lifecycle, like cool that you know that, but like really where did that come from and what's influenced it and what problems does that solve is a pretty powerful thing.
I think our inability to communicate with each other about these things also is like a huge like
the
roadblock.
tribalism of it, I think, is like, will we look back on that one day and be like, wow, that was stupid, we all should have gotten along? Like, I don't know. I think, I hope so. I think the tribalism and the kind of resistance to learning the fundamentals and just kind of clinging to these frameworks and feeling like that's all you need to know. And it's not just developers, it's employers too encourage that. Like they want, you know,
buzzwords.
Yeah, and so I think just as an industry, we're not focused on fundamentals. I think we also haven't learned how to teach them. So that's a hard thing. Like I can say, oh, you should learn them, but we haven't really learned how to teach them, how to teach those fundamental problem-solving skills. It's a lot easier to teach someone how to make a UI with React than to teach the fundamental problem-solving skills.
And teaching is like a whole separate job. You have people who are really good engineers, or like they're good at writing code, but they're not good at communicating, and that's okay. But when they're rolling their own frameworks and then they expect everyone to just adopt what they're saying, there's this sort of communication block, and that's where all this like terrible rhetoric sort of comes from. I just tried out a framework I heard about at NodeConf Oslo by this guy Yash, who's really cool. It's called Chew, and I like made like a Hello World app, and like I just posted on GitHub, and someone's like, "So, is this better than React?" I'm like, "That is like not a question."
The point.
Yeah, it's like not like a question that can be answered. So we have to be better at like communicating like what we're looking for. So like try making like a boilerplate like of what you would use if you were starting the app, and then say, "I did this. How can I do this better? What would provide a better space for that?"
And I even went through the exercise earlier this year of like building my own React. It wasn't my own React, and I'm not going to put the code anywhere that you can see it, but building that myself, like, okay, I want a thing that does the whole re-render thing, and I want like, and just, that was a really powerful exercise too, because you kind of, in the course of it, realize like, oh, that's why that works that way, and wow, I had never thought about how hard this part must be. That's a really powerful thing too, to just kind of like explore your tools, not as a user, but like, how would you make this thing?
Yeah, getting closer to the metal.
Yes.
And as
but
close as you can get with JavaScript.
PPK kind of way, because that was a pretty shitty thing to say last week. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
Did I just violate the code of conduct by saying shitty?
No, not at all. No.
All right.
I was going to mention, like, didn't he write a blog post about like how everyone should stop innovating for a year so we can catch up? And I'm like, that's not how life works.
But life works that way, I guess.
Yeah.
But.
Also, like, thinking, when I was in grad school, I had to write a compiler, and I was like, why would, no one's going to use this compiler, like this is like too much work.
That.
But then like you get a better understanding of like the things that the higher level languages.
This is how this happens.
Yeah, so working your way backwards. Cool, thank you so much.
Thank you.